Welcome to our program, The Way Forward. I am Chanaka De Silva. This program, we bring in to meet all the industrial leaders of various categories who will advise us on how we can get us, this country, out of this situation as soon as possible and get back to normal. Today on our show, we have Mr. Malik Fernando, Director Dilmah, and also in charge of the luxury hotels of the Dilmah Group. Welcome to the show, Malik.
Thank you, Chanaka.
Malik, with this situation, less said the better, but this unfortunate situation where we have got a direct hit on tourism, how would you see the damage as at now at ground level?
See, damage clearly is devastating because tourism, after 30 long years of war, had gathered some momentum, and our focus is on the more affluent traveler, because a lot of the visitors who come to Sri Lanka are lower, the more informal sector with lower budgets and so on. So our whole focus is on bringing in the luxury traveler who will spend more, because we firmly believe that tourism here should be more focused on value-added, smaller number, but a higher spend, as opposed to bringing in millions of tourists who don't really spend much. So in that context, it took a huge amount of effort in order to get the high-end traveler from the United States, from the UK, Scandinavia, Australia, to be convinced in their mind that Sri Lanka was a safe place to travel to post the conflict that ended in 2009. So that process is still ongoing in the minds of some people, because we didn't do a proper post-war marketing campaign. So on an ongoing basis for the last 3 or 4 years, we needed to convince people that Sri Lanka was safe to travel to. And you could see that momentum, and it was working. So to have this attack just when we were gathering steam is obviously extremely frustrating and a major setback. As you said, it's done, so we can't look too much to the past, but it really has been extremely damaging, and we need to be a lot more intelligent about getting out of this mess than the level of intelligence employed in getting into the mess.
How would you say right now, like we are in the off season, but we have, I think yesterday's conference said something about a 60% loss of arrivals.
See, what happened was that, fortunately, thank God that the peak season, which ends around Easter in April, from the peak season from December through till April, that had just finished. If the attacks had happened in January or February, the impact would have been far, far more devastating. From April, you have a low season until about August, which is when Western Europeans travel again during their summer holidays. But having said that, with increased travel from the Middle East, from India and other parts of the world, and Australia, because it's Australian winter, May, June, July, it was starting to level out. This concept of having an off peak was less and less likely, because we were having even 40%, 50% arrivals in that season, with newer markets coming into play. But still, it's not as bad. So we were fortunate in terms of the timing, that the peak season had just ended, obviously because it was targeted at Easter Sunday. So the impact is of cancellations running from, say, a 60% or 50% occupancy down to about a 10%. So it is pretty devastating. However, the bigger fear is the pickup for new bookings for the summer and the next peak. That is something that we need to get our act together to quickly rebuild confidence. Because if this is a long drawn out recovery, which could take a year or more, then obviously it would be far more devastating to the industry than having cancellations during a typical low occupancy period.
Right, now when you speak of cancellations, There will be obviously with the travel advisories given, that will go hand in hand. But taking it after that, once they lift those, what is the thing, or rather what are the steps that the country should do immediately, not the long term, immediately to get the traction of
Charlie, there is a fairly standardized process because many countries have gone through this, whether it's terrorism, natural disasters, and so on. And it is basically crisis management. Now, there, I must say, we are pathetically weak because we didn't have a plan, nor do we have a plan currently. A lot of the discussion is dwelling on what happened, why it happened. There is a important dialogue going on about financial assistance for hoteliers and smaller operators, which is important. But the critical thing which is being neglected, in my view, is how are we going to rebuild and get tourists coming in here again. So I've just returned from a media tour of Australia and Japan and trade visits. And particularly in Australia, there is a huge outpouring of support for Sri Lanka because of the fact that for the last 4 to 5 years, we had a very vibrant tourism arrival position. Lots of travelers and lots of travel agents have fallen in love with Sri Lanka. It's not like before where many hadn't come at all, so they needed to be convinced. Here, all the travel trade have been, they love the country, so they're very, very supportive. However, in order for them to be able to successfully sell the country, the travel advisories need to be lifted. Yes. Now, I'm firmly of the view that some of those advisories were brought in due to bungling of the post-attack management of the situation, because terrorist attacks can happen anywhere, randomly. In this case, the authorities absolutely messed up in terms of ignoring the specific alerts. However, after it happened, if there had been a more effective response, I am convinced that some of the advisories would have been softer than the levels to which they were escalated. So in terms of getting these advisories revised, which is critical, because in some countries, UK and Australia for one, some continental countries, travel insurance doesn't apply. So a lot of people would take out travel insurance, medical insurance as well. So if something were to happen, it's very categorical, insurance doesn't apply. So that puts people off. Particularly tour operators and so on would not want to take the risk. Independent travelers, some may take the risk, but in the light of these advisories, many would not. So that's why we're having cancellations. The cancellations have largely been for May and June. There have been some for July, and there's the odd one for even November, December, January, the next peak season, because people really don't know. So that gets to my next point, which is that we have no plan to speak in one voice with an effective crisis management plan, because dissemination of information and reassuring travelers and the travel trade that Sri Lanka is safe, and explaining the steps that are being taken, and there are many steps being taken, that isn't happening, so people don't know what's going on. So my anger is that if you go onto Google now and you just type in, is Sri Lanka safe? I did this last night. The number one response that comes up is Sri Lanka is very volatile, attacks can happen at any time. Now, those of us living here know that the military seem to have things under control. But if you're living outside, you're relying on websites. You're relying on news sites, which operate largely on, sometimes alarmist news. There is also a theme that there is a serious risk of communal violence. And we know that with the seriousness that the authorities take that, and the calming voice of the cardinal, and how the religious leaders have got together, that is unlikely, because if we do that, then we are falling into the hands of the terrorists, because that's exactly what they want to do. but that message is not being clearly explained overseas. So I'm getting, as do many of my colleagues in the trade, they're getting so many inquiries from travel agents as well as travelers. What's going on? How can we find out what's going on? So all of us in our individual way are explaining it, but there is no single point of contact. Just like there is no, typically in a disaster management scenario, there is a single official spokesman who would gather a variety of news, security news, tourism updates, logistical news, what's happening at the airport. So right now, you have many people speaking in different tongues, saying different things, which is not helpful. And that's the kind of thing that the media pounces on overseas to spread that message of confusion. And as I said on Google, volatile. It's volatile because there are people who will make volatile speeches or press conferences, alleging all kinds of things. So even in terms of future threats, my message when I was overseas, as I said, talking to the media, we had a very successful press lunch with 40 of the top luxury travel media in Sydney. And my message to them was, if you look at it strategically, geopolitically, this was a very isolated fringe group. The group had been outed, reported by the Muslim community for several years, and the authorities did nothing. The Muslim population of Sri Lanka is 99.9% moderate. Most of the Tipoffs are coming from the Muslim population themselves, because they don't want their hitherto peaceful 1,000-year-old existence in amity with the other communities threatened by a bunch of radicals. So that message, if I'm outside, that would be reassuring, because if I know that the terrorists are not don't have a sympathetic local population who would shelter them.
That will assure them that they can't grow here.
Exactly. There's nowhere to hide. The Tipoffs are coming from the Muslim community. And Sri Lanka is an island. It's not like other countries which have conflicts where they can retreat back, regroup and come back. And our forces, with their previous ability to handle a far more complex conflict on multiple fronts, particularly with the amount of information they're getting, for them it's relatively easy. As we heard the military spokesman yesterday saying that they have it well under hand. But does the travel trade and travelers overseas know this? Not at all. They have no clue. We are not communicating that. There is no channel to do that. So that's something that we felt, a group of us got together and we said, look, we're going to take charge in terms of the communication. So we are starting an initiative which is led by the private sector, where we are developing a portal, and we will try and agglomerate all the relevant news about Sri Lanka being safe to travel, news updates, security updates and so on, and feed that through to the international travel trade in cooperation with the entire travel industry in Sri Lanka, who share my frustration. We have a very small unit with 3 luxury hotels. There are others who've got much bigger investments. And they're all equally frustrated that the proper messaging isn't happening. That is the fundamental key to recovery after terrorist attack. Whether it takes 3 months or 3 years depends on that. Here we've got such potentially great messaging that can reassure people, but that is not getting out. So we've decided to get together and fix it. The other aspect is also how alarmist news spreads. I got a WhatsApp last night.
Yes, you were saying now, that's the interesting part. What would be the best way for the government to literally pull its socks up and get this what you call alarmist news and things like these letters circulating on WhatsApp under control?
See, what's happening now is, there's been obviously a breakdown in the intelligence apparatus, and that is a real pity, because the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. With the threats that we have, we cannot relax, which is what we did. But what has to happen is, there has to be a coordination of intelligence. The way it happens now is that there are so many arms, they will get their own intelligence, which doesn't get funneled up analytically for threat assessment. So what happened yesterday was quite, if it wasn't so serious, it'll be hilarious. There's a WhatsApp message that goes around saying that such and such specific attack is going to happen on such and such a day.
Right. I'll interrupt you for a moment. We are going in for a short break now on this program, and once we are back, we will continue on how these messages on WhatsApp are actually creating havoc around the country. Welcome back to the Way Forward program. We have been discussing with Mr. Fernando the way how we could get this country out of this current dilemma of bad publicity caused by these recent upheavals in the country. And we were discussing how the government should best handle these messages which go around on WhatsApp, where actually their own apparent official letters are circulated. Malik, can you will say?
So the example I was telling you about, Lanka, was that, one case of a WhatsApp message that was sent with a letter warning of a serious attack in specific locations on a particular date, and it gives the time, it gives the specific locations, and you know that kind of intelligence is, when you read it, you know it's laughable, except if it wasn't potentially so serious. So I made further inquiries, because the last thing we should do is to forward that to another 100 people. And that's how panic ensues, and the message that Sri Lanka is volatile and attack can happen at any time, which I firmly do not believe, given the level of control that the forces seem to have. And when I inquired further, I found out that there are, say, multiple, with its police or military, there are multiple organizations, all which have parallel overlapping intelligence. So when something comes, say, to a particular unit, there is no collation, there is no dissemination, verification by, shall we say, smarter people or people who would know.
Right.
So each of those independent arms will go to a typewriter, type the detailed message that was given, and sort of a send all in government. So it's a nice, beautiful typewritten letter saying this is a specific attack, which is sent to all employees of a particular state institution. And that's the letter that came to me, but then obviously similarly it's been sent to others as well. And when I spoke to the military, and they said that this was nonsense, that there is a weakness in the intelligence gathering, that essentially it's almost like, it's like posting on Facebook that there's such and such a threat.
Right.
Whereas normally what should happen and what used to happen was that that threat would be assessed by people who would know, who would verify and double, triple check, and if it looked to be genuine, they would take necessary precautions, not alarm everybody, not alert few thousand people, but do what was necessary. This current process in some units of scaremongering by issuing typewritten letters which obviously leak,
Yes.
Without any saying there is such and such a threat, so you don't even really know what to do about it except to stay at home. So no wonder parents don't send their kids to school or so on, because there is real ambiguity, whereas typically there needs to be an assessment of the level of seriousness and risks. I think that needs to be fixed. Secondly, there needs to be a fake news or a verification number or a WhatsApp address, ideally, where people can forward alerts and alarms they get to report potentially fake news, so that the authorities can nip it in the bud. Now, I get something which is, say, an absolute joke, but is alarmist, and maybe some people take it seriously. What do I do? Who do I report it to? Who do I verify it with? So what should have happened by now, in my view, given the importance of sanity and calmness prevailing, is some means of the public being able to verify, is this authentic or not? And if it's not, then the authorities should be able to investigate and take action against if they can find out who's spreading it. So, it's connected to my earlier point about messaging, about confusion.
Yeah, because one of the, I think, the main weapons of the terrorist is confusion.
Yeah.
Right? And the longer why we decided to have these programs is the longer they keep us in a state of confusion and fear and panic, they gain mileage, whereas
Exactly.
we lose.
Yeah.
So I believe that we should gather our feet together and look beyond this.
Absolutely.
Because we have gone through, as you know, I know, a far worse time,
Yes.
right? A far, far worse
Yes.
time, where the community was at war with us and an enemy we couldn't see. Right now, as you very well said, the Muslim community itself is helping, which means they don't want any part of these people either,
Exactly.
which is a huge strength for us.
And it's anyhow a very small fringe group.
Yes.
That unfortunately is not being communicated
What
adequately.
should the government, now you said about a number,
Yeah.
would you say that they should have either a website or a spokesman coming on national TV or something like that every day and updating people on
See,
these
part
things?
of the problem is that government, as we know, is dysfunctional and doesn't speak in one voice. So
Yes.
it makes it much harder.
harder.
But logically, what a government should be able to do is to say this is the official spokesman, someone with responsibility who understands the gravity of what he or she says, and then that there is cool, calm dissemination of data. I mean, if you look at this whole thing, the people who have credibility now, in my view, are the cardinal and our armed forces. The government has lost a lot of credibility with the confusion that and the blame game that's been played. So ideally, in an ideal world, which may not be practical, is that there should be a central one number you call to verify news, one source of disseminating warnings. But there are so many overlapping institutions and personalities and so on that it becomes difficult. That's a huge frustration. Given the
Magnitude of the issue.
magnitude of the level of development, the investment, the growth in tourism, which was heading to be our number one industry, number one employer. Now, if tourism is shot in the foot, the prospects for Sri Lanka are very dim.
Yeah.
I, for one, am very bullish because of the fact that what tourists love about Sri Lanka is still intact, but their confidence needs to be restored through far better communication. Governments typically anywhere in the world aren't great communicators, so I think it's left to the private sector, certainly when it comes to tourism, to start this portal to disseminate information and to be able to speak in one voice and to be a kind of a go-to site for travelers and travel agents to know what's going on, because there's no way, apart from sending an email saying, look, what's going on, people out there are pretty much in the dark as to the fact that the situation here is much better than you would think. Given the fact that there's not been any further attacks, given the fact that there's not been any widespread violence, and people just want to get on and rebuild.
And what would you say in a nutshell? With the portal idea, I think it is fantastic, and also the government must have one voice, no matter what it says, about allaying the fears of the public and who are also the world listening. What would be, say, one or two other things that you would strongly suggest that we should do, like in terms of perhaps publicity, have a new outlook of like attracting more people here. Someone suggested this visas, the fees, all that to be taken off, and to have this thing to get people in. As a travel person, what would you suggest?
See, the fundamental thing is that people have to feel quite safe to travel, because terrorism, they know, can be a hit and run. It can hit you randomly anywhere, but they need to feel safe. They need to feel that the intelligence of potential threats, because that's the primary tool, not so much boots on the ground and military at all the key locations, which right now is reassuring, but that can't continue forever.
Yes.
The fundamental thing is there's going to be very good intelligence, and for the reason I explained before, there's lots of intelligence that comes from within the community itself. That's the primary thing. Things like visas and discounts, I mean, visas were not expensive in the first place, and it was never a deterrent. The e-visa works very easy online, so that was maybe a little tactical thing in the off season, but it's really about building confidence. People feeling safe, and also making it a lot more seamless. The current chaos at the airport isn't helpful at all. I mean, that should have been fixed day one, but typically from my past experience, no one knows whose responsibility it is. The departure lineups where cars that are going to drop people off as well as pick up are all in the same queue, whereas cars that are going to drop off should obviously have a priority, because the departure vehicles can come earlier. Also on arrival, I arrived a few days ago, and then to wheel your bag in rain out onto a main road where vehicles have no room to park. So they've gone overboard on security because they are in that area. It wasn't intelligent security in my view, because there could have been a holding area where you get picked up in the car park or something. So those things which can be friction, the arriving, departing experience, that needs to get fixed. But primarily it's about clear communication, realistically, of how the situation here is. Then that will pick up people's confidence. Also showcasing people who do come, and this is one of the ideas of the portal, that their experiences, they're recorded, their comments are showcasing. Share. We've come, we've had a lovely holiday, and also to have a PR media push where you get journalists in and they promote the destination and so on. But that would happen in parallel with people feeling confident that they would be safe. And for that, a key part is the advisories. So we need to understand why an advisory is placed, what are the conditions in which it is escalated or de-escalated. There's no point us just crying saying, look, advisories, lift the advisories, because the diplomats generally in these countries, it's accountable, there is a process, there's very little political involvement. Diplomats, bureaucrats are just doing their job. They have a template. So we need to understand what are the changes required in the ground conditions for them to lift their advisory. One of the critical things why they clamp the advisory and why they're probably delaying lifting it is the point I said about clarity of information flow. So like this WhatsApp message that goes around saying there's going to be such and such an attack, of course the diplomats get to know about it, get to see it, it appears in the local papers, it appears on social media. So they say, okay, well, we've got an advisory, don't come.
We are following
don't come. So, people need to understand the implications of all of this. The advisories would be revised once, because a lot of these countries are, want to support Sri Lanka at a time of need, but, you can't apply pressure on them to lift the advisory unless we ourselves get our house in order. In terms of some of these rumors and the point about volatility, that has to go. There has to be a sense of calmness, a sense of someone being in charge. Once that happens, then you find the advisories get lifted.
Right. So it is basically reassuring people of the security that will be available for them once they come here, and credibility by the government of what they are, or rather what they mean, what they say as far as the safety goes.
Absolutely, because since people know widely that there were alerts that were ignored, I mean that's a very serious thing. Right. So they need to have reassurance that that scenario can never happen again.
Right. Thank you, Malik. We have come to the end of our program today on the way forward. We had a lot of interesting points and suggestions by Mr. Fernando, who I am sure has given us things that we can use. Next week as well, we are going to have another interesting person who will, I believe, help us in getting our country back on track. Thank you.